The morning alarm rang at 6 o'clock, and Claire Bennett was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment in downtown Chicago, listening to the city slowly come to life outside her window. Taxis humped somewhere below. A newspaper truck rumbled past. On the floor above her, a neighbor's dog scratched restlessly against the hardwood. She was 24 years old. With warm brown eyes and dark chestnut hair, she always wore pulled back in a neat bun, and a face people had described, more than once, as too honest. Whatever she felt showed plainly, whether she wanted it to or not. When she was happy, there was no mistaking it. When she disagreed with something, her expression said so long before her mouth caught up. It was a trait that had cost her friendships over the years, and more than a few uncomfortable evenings, but it had also earned her something rarer than popularity, the complete trust of everyone who truly knew her. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the only daughter of Robert Bennett, a carpenter with hands roughened by 30 years of honest work, and Margaret Bennett, a schoolteacher who believed, above almost everything else, in the value of telling the truth even when it was inconvenient. It was the one unbending rule of the household Claire had grown up in: tell the truth, always, and she had absorbed it so completely that dishonesty, even the smallest, kindest lie, left her stomach twisted in something close to physical pain. That morning, she made herself black coffee and opened her laptop, determined to finish 3 job applications before noon. She had been unemployed for 2 months, let go from a small marketing firm during a round of budget cuts that had, if she was honest with herself, probably been made easier by the fact that she had refused to stay quiet about a misleading ad campaign her supervisor had wanted to run. She did not regret speaking up. She only regretted that speaking up so rarely seemed to matter to the people who mattered most in a company. She was scrolling through a fresh batch of rejection emails when one subject line stopped her scrolling entirely. Invitation to interview, Hartwell Industries, executive assistant to the CEO. She sat up straighter in her chair. Hartwell Industries was not an ordinary company. It was one of the largest privately held corporations in the country, with holdings across technology, real estate, and renewable energy. Its CEO, Nathan Hartwell, 32 years old, had appeared on the covers of 3 major business magazines in the past year alone, known equally for his extraordinary instincts and his complete refusal to tolerate dishonesty in any form. 3 executive assistants had left his employment in the last 6 months, and the rumors circulating on professional forums painted him as cold, demanding, and impossible to satisfy. Claire had applied on a whim one exhausted evening, expecting nothing. She stared at the invitation for a long moment, then typed her reply without hesitation. I will be there. The headquarters of Hartwell Industries occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue, and Claire arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn to every interview that month, pressed and clean even if it was not new. She could not afford new, but everything she wore was neat, and she carried herself the way her mother had taught her, with her chin level and her eyes steady, whatever she was feeling underneath. The receptionist, a polished young man named Derek, looked her over with poorly hidden curiosity before showing her to the waiting area, where 2 other candidates sat, a woman in an expensive suit checking her phone every few seconds, and a man in his 30s silently rehearsing answers under his breath. At exactly 9 o'clock, Derek reappeared. Miss Bennett? Mr. Hartwell is ready. She was surprised to be called first, but she said nothing about it. She followed him into an elevator, up to the 42nd floor, and down a long, silent corridor to a set of double doors, beyond which sat an office of almost military precision, every object on the desk arranged with exact purpose, the bookshelves organized by subject, and a view of Lake Michigan spread out like something from a postcard. Behind the desk sat Nathan Hartwell, tall, even-seated, with dark hair, sharp blue eyes, and a jaw that seemed carved from something harder than bone. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, and he did not stand when she entered, did not smile, only gestured at the chair across from him. Sit. Claire sat. He studied her resume in silence for nearly 30 seconds. She did not fill the quiet with nervous chatter, only waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap. You were at Meridian Marketing for 2 years, he said finally. You were let go. Yes. The standard answer at this point is that the company downsized and it had nothing to do with your performance. Is that what you're going to tell me? That's what actually happened, Claire said. But I'll also tell you that in my last 3 months there, I flagged concerns about a campaign I believed was misleading to consumers. My supervisor disagreed. That tension may have made me easier to cut when the time came. Something sharpened in his eyes, though his expression barely changed. You flagged misleading advertising to your supervisor, and you're telling me this in a job interview. You asked me a direct question, Claire said. I don't give indirect answers. A pause stretched between them, long enough that she felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Most candidates spend this interview trying to impress me, he said at last. I'm trying to be accurate, she replied. If the accurate version of me impresses you, then we're both in luck. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and something shifted in the air, almost imperceptibly. Tell me something you're not good at. Reading social cues under pressure, she said, without hesitation. I can become too direct in situations that call for diplomacy. I'm working on it, but it's a real limitation. Tell me something you are good at. Organization, pattern recognition, and people trust me, which means they tell me things. That makes me effective in a support role because I usually know what's actually happening before it becomes a crisis. He set her resume aside with an air of finality. My previous 3 assistants lasted a combined total of 14 months. Do you know why? Because you're demanding, and they told you what they thought you wanted to hear instead of what was true, Claire said. And eventually the gap between the two became unworkable. The silence that followed was long enough that she wondered if she had gone too far. Then Nathan Hartwell said, simply, "Be here Monday, 7:30, and the interview was over. Working for Nathan Hartwell was every bit as demanding as the rumors had promised. He arrived at 7 and rarely left before 9 or 10 at night. He expected flawless accuracy in his calendar, his correspondence, his travel, his briefings, and he offered little in the way of praise or small talk. But what no one had warned Claire about was how much she would come to respect him. He never made a promise he didn't keep. He never blamed others for his own mistakes. When he was wrong in a meeting, he said so plainly and moved on to fixing it, with no patience for spin or performance of any kind. In many ways, she realized within the first month he was exactly like her. On her 3rd day, she reviewed a real estate contract he had asked her to check and found a clause on page 18 that gave the other party an exit option Hartwell Industries did not share. He studied it, admitted he had missed it, and said only, "Good catch." From a man who gave praise the way most people gave up a kidney stone, it meant more than she expected it to. In her 2nd week, she made a mistake, double booking him for a board call and a lunch with a visiting senator on the same afternoon. She caught it with only 48 hours to fix it, and she walked straight into his office without excuses. "I made a scheduling error. Here are 3 solutions," she said, laying a memo on his desk. He asked which she recommended. She told him. He agreed, told her not to let it happen again, and she never did. By the end of that first month, something had settled between them. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of solid professional ground that felt, to Claire, like something she had been missing for a long time. It was during her 2nd month that she began to notice the smaller, quieter things about him. The framed photograph he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, glimpsed once by accident, of a woman and a young boy. The way his driver always took a longer route home on Friday evenings, past a North Side neighborhood that had nothing to do with where he actually lived. The way he sometimes sat completely still at his desk, not working, simply thinking, with an expression that had nothing to do with business at all. She did not ask. It was not her place. But she noticed. Behind the scenes of her growing professional life, Claire's family in Ohio was quietly struggling. Her father's small carpentry workshop had been losing money for months. Competition from larger prefabricated furniture companies had eaten into his usual clients, and though he never said so outright, because admitting it would mean admitting he needed help, Claire could hear the exhaustion creeping into his voice every time she called home on Sunday evenings. "Business is a little slow," he would say, in the same tone he used to describe the weather, and Claire would let the lie pass without comment, because she understood it was not really a lie, only a kind of pride that neither of them wanted to disturb directly. Her mother's teaching salary alone could not cover the widening gap, and Claire began quietly sending money home from her own paycheck, taking on small freelance proofreading jobs on the weekends to have a little extra to spare. She told no one at Hartwell Industries. Her professional life and her family's struggles were, in her mind, separate rooms, and she had never learned how to let one bleed into the other. Every Sunday evening, without fail, Claire called home. It had been a ritual since she first moved to Chicago, one she never let slip, even during the busiest weeks at Hartwell Industries. Her mother usually answered first, filling the first few minutes with news about her students, a difficult parent-teacher conference, the church bake sale that had raised less than expected. Then her father would take the phone, and his voice, however tired, always brightened a little at the sound of hers. "How's the big job treating you?" He would ask the same question every week, and Claire would tell him about Nathan's impossible standards, about the small victories of catching an error before it became a disaster, about the way the city looked from the 42nd floor at sunset. She never mentioned the shadows under her own eyes, the way she sometimes stayed up past midnight finishing freelance proofreading work just to have a little extra to send home. One Sunday in late autumn, her father's voice carried an exhaustion he could not quite hide behind his usual cheerfulness. "Workshop's a little slow this month," he said, the same phrase he always used, the one that meant far more than it said. "Big furniture chains are underselling everybody. Can't compete with a factory price, not with these hands." He laughed, but it did not quite reach the sound of it. "We'll manage. We always have. Dad, if you need." "We'll manage, Claire," he said, gently but firmly, the same tone he had used her whole life to close a subject he did not want opened. "You worry about your own bills up there in the city. Don't you worry about ours." She let it go, the way she always did, because pushing further would only wound the pride that had carried her father through 30 years of honest, difficult work. But she hung up the phone that night with a familiar tightness in her chest, and the following Monday, she quietly transferred a portion of her paycheck into her parents' account under a vague label she knew her father would eventually notice and never mention. Nathan noticed anyway, not the transfers, which she kept entirely private, but the toll they were quietly taking on her. He noticed the faint shadows under her eyes on Monday mornings, the way she sometimes checked her phone with a flicker of worry before composing herself again. He said nothing for weeks, respecting the boundary she had drawn without ever stating it aloud. But one evening, when the office had emptied out and only the two of them remained, he finally asked. "You've been distracted," he said. "That's not like you." She considered deflecting the way anyone else might have. But deflection was not something she knew how to do convincingly. "My father's business is struggling," she admitted. "It's not your concern." "You work for me," he said. "Everything that affects you is, in some sense, my concern." "That's not how employment works," she said, managing a tired smile. "No," he agreed. "But it's how I choose to see it." He offered her nothing that night, understanding, somehow, without being told, that a direct offer would only embarrass her. But within a week, a private contractor unexpectedly reached out to Robert Bennett's small workshop, offering a long-term contract to build custom furniture for a new chain of boutique hotels. Robert Bennett never learned the contract had quietly originated from a company under the Hartwell Industries real estate division. Claire discovered the truth only months later, by accident, and when she confronted Nathan about it, he simply said, "I didn't lie to your father. I just made sure the truth found him." It was exactly like him, quiet, deliberate, generous in a way that never touched her pride. That small act deepened something between them neither of them had yet named aloud. In December, a journalist named Patrick Kay published allegations of insider trading against Hartwell Industries, and the company's stock dropped 8% within a day. Nathan handled the crisis without panic, ordering a full internal audit and, on Claire's direct advice, calling Kay himself to offer complete transparency rather than the silence his other advisors recommended. The audit found the allegations false, uncovered instead a single employee who had misrepresented his own trades to impress colleagues, and the story that eventually ran painted Nathan as a CEO who chose radical honesty in a crisis. His approval among investors rose rather than fell. When the article was published, he set a copy of it on her desk and said only, "You were right." And then, for the first time since she had known him, he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and surprised. By February, something had shifted in the way he spoke to her, something beyond professional regard. He asked to accompany him to a charity gala, not as a date, he said carefully, but because his usual coordinator had broken her ankle. Claire bought a simple dark green dress from a consignment shop, did her hair properly for the first time in months, and when Nathan saw her waiting in the hotel lobby, he stopped walking for the briefest fraction of a second before continuing toward her. Late that evening, after the formal part of the gala had ended, he found her at the edge of the dance floor and asked her to dance, and for a few minutes there was no employer, no employee, no 8-year gap between them, only the music and the warmth of his hand at the small of her back. "This is complicated," he said, when the song ended. "I know," she said, "but I don't think you get to choose." "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't think I do either." She went home that night and sat in the dark of her apartment, honest with herself the way she was honest with everyone else, and admitted, finally, that she was in love with him. Not because he was powerful or successful, but because he was real, because he did not perform himself for anyone, and she had never in her life valued anything more than that. The next morning, she walked into his office and told him plainly. He listened without interruption, and when she finished, he said only, "That's very organized," with the faintest echo of a smile, and told her he would ask HR to restructure her role so she no longer reported directly to him. 2 weeks later, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, they talked for 3 hours about Ohio and Boston, about honesty and loneliness, and a 7-year-old named James who liked dinosaurs and was learning to play chess. Afterward, walking along the lakeshore in the cold February air, he held her hand the way he had on the dance floor, not as a question, but as a fact. For a few months, life settled into something quietly happy. Claire's new role in operations gave her real responsibility without the daily pressure of Nathan's direct schedule, and their relationship deepened in the private hours outside the office. Dinners, quiet weekends, slow conversations that filled in the years they had each spent guarding themselves against exactly this kind of closeness. She met James properly for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in March, and she had spent more time preparing for that meeting than she had for any board presentation. Nathan had warned her, gently, that James was cautious with new people, that he had watched his parents' marriage end at 4 years old and had grown careful in a way most 7-year-olds were not. Claire arrived at the townhouse with a small chess set she had bought specifically for the occasion, not to buy his affection, but because Nathan had mentioned, almost in passing, that his son loved the game. James studied her from the doorway with the same unreadable seriousness his father was famous for in boardrooms across the city, and for a moment Claire feared the gift had been a mistake. Too obvious, too eager. "Dad said you work with him," James said instead of a greeting. "I used to," Claire said. "Now I work in a different part of the company. I still see him a lot, though." "Is that why you're here on a Saturday?" "No," Claire said honestly, because she did not know any other way to answer him. "I'm here because I wanted to meet you, and because your dad asked me to come." James considered this with the same fierce focus he brought to a chessboard, weighing her answer for any sign of performance and finding none. "Okay," he said finally, and held the door open a little wider. "Do you actually know how to play, or did you just buy that because it looked nice?" "I know how to play," Claire said. "I'm not very good, but I know how." "We'll see," James said, already leading her toward the living room table, and by the end of the afternoon he had beaten her twice and drawn once, watching her with a small, satisfied smile every time she failed to see a move coming 3 turns ahead. Nathan, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watched the two of them with an expression Claire had never seen on him before, something unguarded, something close to hope. "He doesn't invite just anyone to play twice," Nathan told her later, once James had gone to bed. "That's about as close to approval as he gives." "High praise," Claire said, smiling. "For both of us." But success, as Nathan had learned long before Claire arrived in his life, always drew enemies, and Hartwell Industries had spent the spring finalizing a massive renewable energy contract, controlling stakes in 3 major solar projects across the Midwest, a deal significant enough to reshape the industry's balance of power for the next decade. It was a deal that Victor Reyes, CEO of a rival firm called Draymond Corp., wanted desperately for himself. Reyes had spent years watching Hartwell Industries outpace his own company at every turn, and the solar contract represented, in his mind, a final chance to reverse that pattern before his own board lost patience with him. He was not a man who operated by the same rules Nathan did. He had people who worked in the shadows on his behalf, contacts willing to do things no boardroom memo would ever admit to. When his usual channels of corporate espionage failed to uncover the leverage he needed, he turned to something far more dangerous. Through weeks of careful, patient surveillance, Reyes's people identified Claire Bennett as the single point of access that mattered most, an executive assistant with knowledge of nearly everything moving through Hartwell Industries, from meeting notes to financial projections to the private conversations that never made it into official records. If anyone could hand Reyes the leverage to derail the solar contract before it closed, it was her. It happened on a Thursday evening in early spring. Claire had stayed late finishing briefing documents for a meeting the next morning, leaving the building a little after 8, walking the 4 familiar blocks toward the parking garage along streets quieter than usual. She took the narrow alley shortcut she had taken 100 times before without a second thought. She never reached her car. A van pulled alongside her as she crossed the alley, and before she understood what was happening, 2 men had seized her from behind. She struggled, managed one sharp cry that dissolved into the noise of the city around her, and then everything went dark. She woke in a small, windowless room with bare concrete walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, her wrists bound tightly behind the chair she had been placed in. Her head throbbed where she had struck it during the struggle, and for a long, terrifying moment panic threatened to swallow her whole. She forced herself to breathe, to think, the way her father had always taught her to think through fear rather than around it, slow breaths, steady focus, one fact at a time. A man entered, introducing himself only as a business associate, though she would later learn his name was Marcus, one of Victor Reyes's most trusted enforcers. He was calm, almost courteous, which somehow made him more frightening than shouting would have. "We just need some information," he said, "about Hartwell's solar contract. The terms, the weaknesses in the deal. You have access to all of it. Give it to us and you go home tonight." "I don't have the authority to share that information," Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And even if I did, I wouldn't." That's a very principled answer for someone tied to a chair. "It's the only kind of answer I know how to give." They asked again. And again. Hours bled into each other without windows to mark their passing. When persuasion failed, they tried something harsher. A bruising grip on her arm, a rough shove against a concrete wall, small cruelties designed to frighten rather than seriously injure, each one testing how far they might need to go. A cut opened above her eyebrow and bled into her hairline. Her shoulder throbbed where she had been shoved too hard against the wall. Still, she gave them nothing that mattered. Only her name, repeated over and over, the way a person clings to the one true thing left to them when everything else is being pulled away. On the second day, Marcus returned with a different approach, softer, almost sympathetic.
"You don't owe him this," he said.
"Loyalty like this doesn't get returned, not really. Give us what we need, and this ends." "You don't know him," Claire said, her voice cracking with exhaustion but not with doubt. "And you don't know me." By the third day, her captor's patience had visibly frayed. The threats grew sharper, the questions more insistent, and still Claire held to the same quiet, unbroken refusal, drawing on a well of stubbornness that had, for most of her life, gotten her into trouble, and now, for the first time, was the only thing keeping her intact. Late that night, when the room outside her door had gone quiet and the single guard left to watch her had drifted into a doze in his chair, Claire tested the ropes at her wrists for perhaps the 100th time and felt, for the first time, a fraction of give in the knot. Her heart pounded as she worked at it slowly, silently, ignoring the raw pain where the rope had rubbed her skin nearly to bleeding. It took nearly 20 minutes, moving in careful, controlled increments so the chair would not creak before her right hand slipped free. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, listening to the guard's breathing, steady and slow, before she reached down with trembling fingers to work at the rope binding her ankles to the chair legs. She had almost freed herself completely when her foot brushed an empty metal can left carelessly near the chair, and the sound of it skittering across the concrete floor was as loud, in that silence, as a gunshot. The guard woke instantly. Claire had only seconds. She lunged for the door on legs that had gone stiff and half-numb from hours of restraint, but Marcus appeared in the doorway before she had crossed half the room, blocking her path with an ease that made her stomach drop. He did not strike her, not that time, only gripped her arm hard enough to bruise and forced her back into the chair, readying the ropes himself with a tightness that left new marks alongside the old ones. "That was brave," he said, almost admiringly as he worked. "Stupid, but brave." "I've been told that before," Claire said, her voice shaking but her chin still lifted. He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Reyes is running out of patience," he said quietly, almost as if warning her. "You should think about that." "So should he," Claire said. "Because the man you're keeping this information from doesn't run out of patience. He runs out of reasons to hold back." Marcus said nothing to that, but something in his expression flickered, just slightly, before he left her alone in the dark again. Back at Hartwell Industries, Nathan realized something was wrong within hours of her disappearance. Claire never missed a morning briefing without calling first. When her phone went straight to voicemail and her apartment sat dark and untouched, a cold, methodical fear settled into him, the kind that in a man like Nathan Hartwell did not surface as panic, but as an absolute, unrelenting focus that swallowed everything else. He called the police immediately, filing a missing persons report within the hour despite the standard waiting period, using every ounce of his company's influence to push the investigation forward faster than protocol usually allowed. He activated every private resource Hartwell Industries had: security consultants, forensic technology specialists, a former intelligence officer who now ran corporate risk assessments for the company. For 3 days, he barely slept, barely ate, and effectively paused the operations of an entire corporation to focus every available resource on a single goal: finding Claire. He reviewed security footage from every camera along her usual route home, cross-referenced license plates, pulled phone records, and worked through the nights at his desk with a controlled, terrifying intensity that unsettled everyone who worked alongside him. His security chief, a former federal investigator named Ellen Marsh, had never seen him like this. Nathan Hartwell, famous for his composure in even the worst boardroom crises, pacing his office at 3 a.m, refusing to sleep until every lead for the day had been exhausted. "We found a partial plate on the van from a traffic camera 2 blocks from the alley," Ellen told him on the second morning, sliding a printout across his desk. "It's registered to a Shell logistics company. Dead end on paper, but I've got people digging into who actually owns it." "Dig faster," Nathan said, and did not apologize for the sharpness in his voice, and Ellen, who had worked with him for 6 years, did not expect him to. He personally called every contact he had in the city: police contacts, private security firms, even a journalist or 2 who owed him a favor, pushing every lever available to a man of his resources without ever crossing into something that would jeopardize the investigation itself. He refused every offer of food from his staff, drank coffee until his hands shook slightly, and twice fell asleep for an hour at a time only because his body finally forced the issue, waking each time with Claire's name already on his lips. It was on the 3rd morning, reviewing a spreadsheet of Shell company registrations his legal team had compiled overnight, that he noticed it, a filing address that matched, almost exactly, an address Draymond Corp had used 2 years earlier for an unrelated subsidiary before quietly dissolving it. It was a small detail, the kind of thing an ordinary observer would have missed entirely, but Nathan had spent 15 years learning to read corporate structures the way other people read faces, and something about the coincidence would not let him go. He had his team cross-reference the burner phone numbers used to contact the Shell Logistics Company against any device that had ever pinged a cell tower near Draymond Corp's headquarters. 2 hits came back. When his security team traced those numbers to an encrypted messaging account, and that account back to a personal device registered carelessly under a cousin of Victor Reyes's assistant, the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. He confronted Reyes directly, without warning, walking into his office with 2 of his security consultants and a calm that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. "Where is she?" Nathan said. It was not a question. Victor Reyes, faced with the full, focused weight of a man who had nothing left to lose, folded within the hour, insisting, weakly, that his own men had gone further than he had authorized. He gave up the location of the warehouse where Claire was being held, and Nathan did not wait for the police to arrive first. He reached the abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city only minutes behind his own security team, moving through the building with a desperate urgency he had never felt in his life. He found her in the small back room, still bound to the chair, bruised, exhausted, but alive, and the moment her eyes met his, something in his careful, controlled composure finally broke. "Claire." He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling in front of her, his hands trembling as he worked at the ropes binding her wrists. "Claire, look at me. I'm here." "I didn't tell them anything," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, as if that mattered more to her, even now, than her own safety. "I didn't say a single true thing about the contract." "I know," Nathan said, his voice cracking with something she had never heard from him before. "I know you didn't. I don't care about the contract, Claire. I only cared about finding you." He carried her out of that building himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her, and did not let go of her hand once during the ambulance ride to the hospital. Her injuries, though painful, were not life-threatening. A mild concussion, a sprained wrist, bruising along her ribs and shoulder that would take weeks to fully heal. But the quieter wound, the fear that lingered in the days that followed, took longer to mend than any of it. Nathan barely left her side during her recovery, moving his morning meetings to her hospital room, arguing more than once with doctors and nurses about her care, not out of arrogance, but out of a desperate need to be useful to her in some way, after feeling so powerless during the days she had been missing. The first night, she woke from a shallow, frightened sleep, certain, for one disorienting moment, that she was still in the concrete room, her wrists still bound. She sat up too fast, gasping, and it was Nathan's voice, low and steady from the chair beside her bed where he had refused to leave, that pulled her back. "You're safe," he said, taking her hand carefully, mindful of the bruising along her arm. "You're in the hospital. I'm right here. You're safe, Claire." She held onto his hand until her breathing slowed, until the concrete room receded back into memory where it belonged, and he did not let go until she fell back asleep, her fingers still curled loosely around his. Over the following days, small, ordinary things became a kind of quiet celebration between them. Her first real meal that didn't come from a hospital tray, the first time she laughed without the sound catching painfully in her bruised ribs, the first night she slept through until morning without waking in fear. Nathan brought her books from her apartment, a soft blanket from her own bed, a photograph of her parents she kept on her nightstand at home, small things that made the sterile hospital room feel a little less like the place her worst days had happened. James visited once, solemn and careful, standing at the foot of her bed with a hand-drawn card that read, "Get well, Claire," in careful, uneven letters, a small chess piece, a white knight, taped to the front of it. "Dad said knights protect the important pieces," James explained, watching her open it. "So, I thought you should have one. For protecting." Claire looked at the small paper knight for a long moment, her throat tight. "Thank you, James," she said. "I'll keep it."
She did.
It sat on her nightstand for the rest of her recovery, and long after, on a shelf in the home she and Nathan would eventually share. It was during one of those quiet hospital evenings, the city lights glowing faintly through the window, that he finally said the words neither of them had spoken aloud before. "I love you," Nathan said simply. "I think I have for a long time. I didn't understand how much until I thought I might lose you." "I love you too," Claire said, her eyes tired but clear. "I have for a while. I just didn't think it was my place to say it first." "It's always your place, Claire," he said, taking her uninjured hand in both of his. "With me, it always will be." Word of what had happened inevitably reached the press, despite Nathan's efforts to keep the worst of it contained. A financial reporter picked up on the sudden, unexplained pause in Hartwell Industries operations during the days Claire had been missing, and within a week a handful of outlets were running speculative stories about an executive assistant's disappearance and its possible connection to the pending solar contract. Nathan handled the growing attention the same way he had handled the insider trading crisis the previous December, not with silence, but with careful, controlled transparency, issuing a single official statement confirming that an employee had been the victim of a kidnapping connected to a corporate rival, that the individual responsible had been identified, and that the company would have no further comment out of respect for her privacy during her recovery. It did not stop every reporter from trying. Two showed up outside Claire's apartment building before Nathan quietly arranged for her to stay at his townhouse until the worst of the attention passed, a practical decision at first that became, within days, simply where she wanted to be. A tabloid ran a badly sourced story, suggesting a secret romance between Hartwell's CEO and his assistant had somehow caused the kidnapping, an insinuation that made Claire so angry she nearly issued her own statement before Nathan gently talked her out of it. "They don't deserve an explanation," he told her. "Not from you. Not about this." "It isn't about deserving," Claire said. "It's about the truth. They're printing something false." "I know," Nathan said. "But sometimes the most honest thing you can do is refuse to hand people something true to twist. Silence isn't always a lie, Claire. Sometimes it's just patience." She let it go, though it cost her something to do it, and within a few weeks the story faded the way most manufactured scandals eventually did, replaced by whatever new controversy the news cycle demanded next. Returning to the office, 6 weeks after the kidnapping, was harder than Claire had expected. She had thought she was ready, physically healed, mentally steadied, eager to return to some version of normal life. But standing outside the glass tower on Michigan Avenue that first morning, she found herself gripped by an unexpected wave of fear, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the door. Nathan, who had insisted on walking in with her though his own schedule that morning had nothing requiring it, noticed immediately. "We don't have to do this today," he said quietly. "Yes, we do," Claire said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the same words she had told the prosecutor weeks earlier. "If I don't walk back in today, it gets harder every day I wait. I know how fear works. I'm not going to let it win this one." She walked through the doors with her chin level and her shoulders set, the same way she had walked into her first interview more than a year earlier, and if her co-workers noticed the faint hesitation in her step as she crossed the lobby, none of them mentioned it, offering instead a quiet, genuine warmth in their greetings that told her, more than words could have, how relieved they were to see her back. By mid-morning, seated at her desk in operations, reviewing a stack of reports that had accumulated during her absence, Claire felt something settle in her chest that had been missing since the night of the alley. Not the absence of fear entirely, because she understood now that some fear would likely stay with her in small ways for a long time, but the return of something steadier beneath it. Purpose. Normalcy. The simple, ordinary rhythm of a life she had fought, quite literally, to keep. In the weeks that followed the rescue, the legal consequences for Victor Reyes and Draymond Corp unfolded with the same relentless thoroughness Nathan brought to everything else. He did not seek a quiet settlement, though his lawyers advised it would be simpler and less publicly damaging to the industry as a whole. Instead, he insisted on full prosecution, providing investigators with every scrap of evidence his security team had gathered, and testifying himself when it came time for the case to move forward. "You could have handled this quietly," Ellen Marsh told him, during one of the final strategy meetings before the case became public. "Protected the company's image. Avoided the headlines." "I'm not interested in protecting an image," Nathan said. "I'm interested in making sure a man like Victor Reyes never gets the chance to do this to someone else." Claire, still healing, insisted on giving her own statement to investigators despite Nathan's quiet worry that reliving it so soon would be too much for her. She sat across from a federal prosecutor with the same steady composure she had carried into every difficult conversation of her life, recounting each day of her captivity in careful, exact detail, refusing to let her voice shake even when the memory of it clearly cost her something. "You don't have to do this today," the prosecutor said gently, midway through the interview, noticing the tightness in her jaw. "Yes, I do," Claire said. "Because if I don't tell the truth about what happened to me, plainly and completely, then it's easier for people to pretend it didn't happen the way it did. I've spent my whole life believing that's the wrong thing to do, and I'm not going to stop now." Marcus, faced with mounting evidence and the very real prospect of a lengthy sentence, eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators, providing testimony that directly implicated Victor Reyes in ordering the kidnapping. Reyes was arrested within a month, and Draymond Corp's board, facing a scandal that threatened to collapse the entire company, forced his resignation before the case had even gone to trial. He would eventually be convicted and sentenced to several years in federal prison, a consequence that brought Claire less satisfaction than she had expected, and more simply, a quiet sense that the matter had finally, truly ended. The solar contract Draymond Corp had wanted so badly closed without incident a month later, Hartwell Industries securing controlling interest in all 3 projects. Nathan barely mentioned it when the deal finally went through. It had, by then, become almost an afterthought beside everything else that mattered more. When she was finally well enough to travel, she asked him to come with her to Ohio, to meet her parents properly, not as her employer, but as the man she loved. Robert Bennett studied Nathan across the kitchen table for a long, quiet moment before speaking. "My daughter doesn't lie," he said. "Not to anyone, not even when it would be easier. If she loves you, then I trust that it's real. I don't need to ask you 100 questions to know that." "I'm grateful for that," Nathan said, "because I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it." Later that evening, once Nathan had stepped outside to take a call, Claire sat with her father alone at the kitchen table, and for the first time in her life, she let herself say the words plainly, the way she said everything. "I love him, Dad. Completely. I know it's complicated, and I know it looks fast from the outside, but I've never been more certain of anything." Robert Bennett reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, the same hand he had held countless times through scraped knees and broken hearts and every honest, difficult truth she had ever told him. "Then that's all I need to know," he said. "You've never lied to me in 24 years. I'm not going to start doubting you now." He kept the conversation to himself for a few days, turning it over quietly, preparing his own heart before finding the right, gentle moment to tell Margaret, who received the news not with worry but with quiet, practical pride. "As long as he makes her happy," Margaret said, "and as long as she can still be exactly who she is with him, that's all that matters to me." The months between the proposal and the wedding were, in their own quiet way, as full as anything either of them had lived through. Nathan proposed on a Sunday evening in early summer, not with an elaborate public gesture, which Claire would have hated, but at her parents' kitchen table in Ohio, with her mother's hand-me-down teapot between them and Robert Bennett pretending, badly, not to watch from the next room. He had asked Robert's blessing privately the night before, sitting on the porch long after Margaret had gone to bed, and Robert had given it without hesitation, though he had made Nathan promise, with the same directness his daughter had inherited from him, that he would never once ask her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. "I wouldn't know how to ask that of her," Nathan had said. "It's the reason I love her." Robert had nodded once, satisfied, and said nothing more about it. Planning the wedding itself became, in its own way, a study of who they both were. Claire wanted simplicity, a small guest list, no press, nothing that turned the day into a performance for anyone but themselves. Nathan, who had spent his adult life surrounded by galas and press events and carefully managed public appearances, agreed to every one of her requests without argument. Relieved, he admitted quietly one evening to plan something in his life that belonged entirely to him and not to Hartwell Industries. Margaret Bennett flew to Chicago twice that summer to help with details neither Claire nor Nathan had the patience for: flowers, seating arrangements, the particular shade of green Claire wanted for the garden lanterns. James took his role as best man with tremendous seriousness, practicing his single line. "You may kiss the bride," which he had appointed himself in charge of announcing, though it was not technically his job, in front of the bathroom mirror for weeks beforehand, until Nathan gently redirected his enthusiasm towards simply holding the rings. The wedding took place the following autumn, in a small garden ceremony that Nathan had insisted remain intimate rather than grand, a decision Claire loved him for more than almost anything else he had ever done. Robert Bennett walked his daughter down a path lined with string lights and late-blooming flowers, and when Nathan took her hand at the end of it, there were no cameras, no headlines, no performance of any kind. Only two people who had built something real out of honesty, respect, and a love neither of them had been looking for, but both had needed more than they realized. James, older now and carrying the same quiet intensity as his father, stood beside Nathan as his best man, solemn and proud in a small suit that did not quite fit him yet. When the ceremony ended, he tugged at Claire's sleeve with the blunt honesty of a child who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the truth was always the safest thing to ask for. "Are you my stepmom now?" Claire knelt to his level, the way she always did when speaking to him. "I am," she said.
"For as long as you'll have me."
"Good," James said simply. "Dad says you're the most honest person he's ever known." "He's said that before," Claire said, smiling. "It's still true," James said, and went off to find the cake. That evening, as the last light faded over the garden and the lanterns were lit one by one, Nathan found Claire standing quietly at the edge of it all, watching their small family gathered together, her parents, his son, the two of them, in a way that felt, finally, unbreakably whole. "Any regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers the way it always did now, without either of them thinking about it. "None," Claire said. "I told the truth. I got the job. I nearly lost everything. And somehow, at the end of it, I got everything instead." Nathan looked at her, the same sharp blue eyes that had once studied her across an office desk, now soft with something that had taken him 32 years and one extraordinary woman to learn how to feel without guarding it.
"So did I," he said.
And for the first time in either of their lives, that was simply, completely the truth. In the years that followed, Claire never stopped being exactly who she was: direct, honest to a fault, unwilling to soften a truth just because it was inconvenient. She rose within Hartwell Industries on her own merit, eventually taking on a leadership role in the company's community investment division, funding small local businesses not unlike her father's workshop had once been, businesses run by people who worked with their hands and told the truth even when it cost them something. Nathan often said, when asked by reporters who had finally learned enough about his private life to ask, that the single best decision he had ever made in business was hiring the one candidate who refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. And on quiet Sunday mornings, in the townhouse on the north side that Nathan had once driven past for reasons he had never fully explained to anyone but himself, Claire would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching James, taller every year, sharper every year, more like his father in ways that made her heart ache with a tenderness she had never expected to feel for a child who was not, by blood, her own, bent over a chessboard, working through some new problem with the same fierce, quiet focus his father brought to everything he touched. And Robert Bennett, visiting from Ohio with Margaret every few months, would sit in the corner of that same kitchen, watching his daughter build a life exactly as honest as the one he and his wife had raised her to want, and think, quietly, that whatever fear he had once carried for her, through the lost friendships, the difficult years, the terrifying days when she had gone missing and he had not slept until she was found, had been worth it, every bit of it, to see her finally, completely, at home in a life built on nothing but the truth. Robert's small workshop, too, had grown steadily over those years, its reputation for honest, careful craftsmanship spreading well beyond the boutique hotel contract that had first kept it afloat. He never learned the full extent of how that first contract had come to find him, and Claire never told him. Some kindnesses, she had come to understand, were better left as quiet gifts than confessed debts, and Nathan had taught her, in his own quiet way, that generosity given without acknowledgement was often the most honest kind there was. On the 5th anniversary of the day Nathan had found her in that concrete room, he did not mark it with anything dramatic, No elaborate gesture, no public tribute, nothing that would have made Claire uncomfortable. Instead, he simply came home early from the office, something he rarely did, and found her in the kitchen with James, now 12 and taller than her by an inch, arguing companionably over a chess move neither of them could agree was sound. "I wasn't sure you'd remember the date," Claire said later that evening, once James had gone up to his room, as the two of them sat together on the back porch watching the last light fade over the yard. "I remember every date that matters," Nathan said. "That one especially. It's the day I understood what actually mattered to me, after 32 years of thinking I already knew." "And what was that?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer, the way she always knew the true answer to almost everything he said. "You," he said simply. "Just you. Exactly as honest and difficult and impossible to fool as you've always been." Claire laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the evening settled around them, quiet and complete. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me." "I don't say things I don't mean," Nathan said. "You taught me that. Or reminded me of it, at least. I think I always knew it somewhere. I just needed someone honest enough to hold me to it." They sat together as the last light faded fully into evening, two people who had built, out of hardship and honesty and a love neither of them had planned for, a life that finally, completely belonged to them. Imperfect in the ordinary ways all lives are imperfect, but true in every way that mattered, down to its very foundation.